Adam Saunders. I've been working in Columbia. I lived in Columbia for the last 20 years. I helped start the Center for Urban Agriculture about 15 to 16 years ago. And that has grown to now a staff of about 22. And we do a wide range of programming. I helped start CCX. I wanted to farm, and so I've always farmed part-time. Starting in 2013, not far from here, just upriver, the river bottoms. My uncle-in-law has some sandy river bottom soil, and I grew vegetables there for 3 years: potatoes, melons, squash. And so I'm like 6'4", 6'5". I realized I'm too tall to be harvesting below ground, and apples are more in my wheelhouse. And so got connected to a mentor I'll talk more about later, and taught me how to graft apple trees, and shifted to nursery orchard care. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more, maybe big picture, about kind of how I work and how I collaborate with landowners and train people to farm. And also then dive into some of the considerations for pest control. So overview, I'm gonna talk about Missouri as an apple growing state, my business, Adams Apples, kind of how I approach it, and then some of the considerations for holistic orchard management, and some time for Q&A. That's kind of where we're going. So here we are in Missouri. We're in these deep river hills in Columbia, Boone County. We're here down in Jeff City, similar soil. And this area historically was a big apple producing region of the world back at the turn of the century. This is before the Grand Coulee Dam and other dam projects out west that now facilitate irrigation in Washington. But there was a lot of settlers who planted orchards right around Columbia, and especially the river hills. So there's deep soil, good drainage. Really a big part of the early wave of homesteaders through here. And apples are a valuable crop, and they can produce 20,000 pounds an acre, that's a lot of food off an acre. So that a lot of that's changed over the century to kind of move towards more production out west in the deserts, where the disease systems are a little more easier to manage. It's a quick market assessment of like where we are in ranking. Missouri is 18th in commercial apple production. And you can see from this chart how quickly it falls off from Washington, which is a huge producer. Acreage has kind of declined over in more recent years, but productivity is per acre is going up. I think that's kind of some of these older orchards that had a really wide spacing have kind of fallen out of production, and therefore production per acre has increased a little bit. Those are the newer orchards. Tighter spacing, more dwarf trees that are easier to manage for disease and picking. So today, I kind of look at apples growing in Missouri. We're on like kind of the southern edge of the growing region, so we have a really long growing season because of that. Our summer varieties start coming out at the last week of June, and in July there's a lot of good varieties. You compare that to New York and Michigan and Minnesota, they can grow those same varieties, but they come in August, September. So we get those into bearing much sooner. And because that, there's also some really long ripening varieties that do well here that in the more northern climates don't do as well. And I think at a macro level, thinking more eastern apple production, or really across the country, diversifying where our frosts are from a national perspective, where the risk is. Like New York has been frosted 2 years in a row. It's the problem there. I'll talk about John Allspaw a little bit later, but he was really did a lot of collection. I'll come back to him in a second. Big influence for me. So buying local, I've been involved in Columbia Farmers Market, helping develop the canopy of the pavilion there and the associated ag park. And that market has about doubled its attendance, doubled its revenue through there. And a lot of what we hear is like, we want more fruit. Strawberries, blueberries, apples, peaches, of course, are always a big thing. So there's a demand pull that we know is there. Grocery stores, like CSA subscriptions or workplace CSA subscriptions. my read is that there's a huge demand for local food and fruit being easily accessible. You can eat it right there. And then local cider, Perry, which is cider made out of pears. I work with Waves Cider Company. They're up in Columbia. The same owners of Logboat Brewery. I'll talk about them a little bit later too. I think there's a big movement now in like the homesteaders and the hobby farms and kind of that really integrated mix of agriculture and residential together, agriburbia, I sometimes call it. There's this influx of people on the land, and social media has really facilitated that because I think people to get into agriculture, you need a lot of things, and a role model and a coach is one of them, arguably the most important things you can have. And with the social media, like you can go talk to anybody in the world and figure out how they raise chickens or how they compost and how they raise fruit. And so it's really networked a lot of people. And then you think of like the influx of people off the coasts looking for cheaper land. There's a lot of folks moving to this part of the world and buying land. They can buy some land. So, but they all, like I said, almost all could use extra help and expertise to set up systems that are going to work and are going to be profitable, or not huge money pits. They can actually pay for themselves. People crave that hands-on learning. I think we see that with CCUA. There's a lot of folks who want to build community. So a question I've wondered in kind of over the years is how do apples play in as a keystone piece of farming operations? Apples are, well, know apples, they've eaten apples, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of tradition here. So on it, you could think of that as an individual farm. How do apples like help get something started out of just vacant land that's there? And how do it's potentially very profitable per acre system because it produces a lot of fruit and there's markets for it. And then envisioning how can apples as a regional effort coordinate things. So again, more questions than answers. So this is what kind of Adam's apples is one of my hats that I wear, and so established 2016. And really, I want to talk about John Allspaw. This picture of John, he passed away a few years ago. This is his nursery. He grafted for about 30, 40 years, was doing variety trials in his backyard. He grew up as a farm kid down in southern Missouri, and he kind of took me under his wing, and we talked like every day for the last 6, 7 years of his life. And I learned a lot about how to propagate rootstocks, how to graft, how to care for trees, how to collect data. He was a statistics professor. I have a stat degree, so we really shared a lot of interest in data, ripening order. He wrote a book that's really good. And so I looked at, he's not really wired as an entrepreneur. He was more wired as a scientist and a hobby farmer. There's something to do in his retirement. I'm a little more wired as an entrepreneur. Like, well, how do I take this man's life work, 30 years of knowledge that I've inherited here? What do I do with that? So I feel a strong urge to continue his legacy and build on it, stand on his shoulders to do something in this region. So I put together kind of a business that's, I'll talk to you real quickly here, get to our topic. So it's vertically integrated. I do grafting. A little nursery in downtown Columbia, produce these trees. This is John's nursery. They'll grow about, that's a good pair. It's taller than me, like it's a 7 foot in 1 year. I flag them, I dig them, I take them to farms. We install custom orchards. I've got help that takes out there to do pruning. We do a lot of tillage around our trees as a way to reduce fescue. You can say fescue a bunch because fescue is one of the hardest things to grow apple trees around. So we're planting buckwheat around these dwarf trees. Establishing a garden for our friend here. We do a spray system. I'll pause here for a second. This is kind of a look at how when I spray, I have this big green tank where I make my holistic brews, like a mix of clay and probiotics and neem oil and fertilizers and other things. And I transfer it to a battery powered backpack and then I hand apply. So it's more labor intensive, but it's very precise because I'm getting my wand right in around every tree. Very light on the land because it's my footprints through there. Pretty cheap system compared to blast sprayer, but and it puts me in good shape because I carry a lot of work. So that's the downside of this system. Anyway, Another example of I put all my apples on trellis, so that black line on the bottom there is a drip tape that facilitates irrigation. That top wire helps them get upright. For my dwarf systems, I run a couple more wires and a higher density of posts. This is a semi-dwarf block, so I'm less worried about overbuilding the trellis because I know my trees will size up a lot better. Here's an orchard down Smith Hatchery Road, and this is a variety trial block. Beautiful setting, big pond there. Another one of my clients, their barn, and there's fruit coming out, and ultimately going to wave cider. So one of my friends who's a grower in the area. So you kind of see there's a vertical integration. I do nursery work, I do the layout, I do the design, I plant them, I spray them, I pick the fruit, I sell the fruit, and I work with other growers to also merchandise fruit. So it's kind of a whole system, top to bottom, that's pushing. And really the goal, I think, is supports landowners to establish acreage. This is a lot of folks from Logboat planting out an orchard a couple years ago. The cider apples there will feed into their system. There's a lot of folks, I think, in the homesteading movement, and just people who have money to buy land, they want to do something with their land. They want to make some money off of it. They want to be involved in the local food system. But again, there's not a lot of time for them or expertise. They feel like they don't want to do it alone. They want a community. So how can we help pull that together? And I think that's part of the bigger sense of holistic orchard management beyond the pest control. Like, we got to have landowners who want to do this. I see myself in the middle, and then how do people I hire to plug into the system? I don't really think people are the limiting resource of this model and more regenerative agriculture. And so we need to find a way to recruit people, educate them about the million things they need to know to be a farmer, and retain them by paying them well, finding ways to keep them diversified. So there's a win-win-win out there that I'm really pushing for. And I see that we're right on the cusp of, or we're doing already. Landowners want to do more. People want these jobs. We're going to get more productive systems on the land than just pesky pastures that get mowed once a year, or just a lot of idle land out there. There's a need for orchards. There's compatibility with the seasons. Orcharding is very seasonal. So like, what are the opposite season things? Nursery work is part of that. I have a forestry degree and a master of forestry. So managing our woodlot, most of our forests around here are unmanaged, and they need thinning. They need really valued. One of the biggest industries in the state is the sawmill industry, the wood products industry, and so there's a lot of opportunity there. I think as well, managed intensive grazing is a nice complementary thing. I did this long feasibility study on a mobile meat processing business that I think is ready to go. We need people to make it run. And some silvopasture, and that's kind of the integration of like planting trees in pasture and having improved forage, and then managing our woodlots with flash grazing. And then construction. My wife's an architect. We built a house during the pandemic in our backyard, and everybody on my orchard crew has also swung a hammer with me, just so because I don't want to. They want more work. And so I think to make this work, we need to find complementary industries to work. So anyway, that's a little bit about my approach, kind of getting into the meat of the topic of holistic orchard management. Michael Phillips, he literally wrote the book. These are 2 copies that I've read many times over and referenced regularly. And Michael really proposed a paradigm shift on how to approach fruit production and farming using some of my words here, not his words, a probiotic brew of diversity of biologicals to kind of just like we think of how do we have a healthy microbiome in our gut or our skin, like how do we on the face of the tree, the bark, the buds, the leaves, the stems, the fruit, how do we encourage a healthy microbiome that's in diversity? And it's not all apple scab, because apple scab is part of the microbiome on the tree. So how do we provide a probiotic approach to counter that? He also uses a lot of basic elements, copper, sulfur, as kind of disease control, but calcium and silica as ways to further fertilize the fruit, to stiffen the fruit. Calcium sprayed on the apples makes them crispier. And in some research has shown that it can actually, if there's a bug in the fruit, you get a nice calcium, that fruit can crush that bug. It kind of, that's a fascinating thing that needs more research. It's all these things to manage diseases and really promoting plant health. If we've got a weak plant out there because it's trying to infest you and it's got compacted soil and nutrient deficiencies, how can we expect that tree to be able to fight off a disease? We really need to focus on plant health. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Pest control, Michael's approach really is more relies on repellents, barriers. So in my spray, I use a clay as kind of a clay-based spray. I use a kaolinite clay, and that gets on the leaf, and it provides a residue when the bugs land on there. It gets in their eyes, it gets in their bellies, it's in their armpits, their reproductive parts, and they just can't thrive. It's not, it doesn't kill them necessarily, but it definitely slows them down and doesn't create a hospitable environment. That clay is also a carrier for neem oil, Karanja oil, which has some pest repellent benefits. It's a carrier for that probiotic. Clay is so negatively charged. So how do these, the brew that we have from EM1 or New Life Ag or Bacillus subtilis, how do these attach to the clay? And the clay is a delivery point, and that clay sticks to the plant. And then what happens after that? There's again, I have more questions than answers, but that's kind of my understanding of kind of the functional move of clay. Mentioned earlier, we're on the southern edge of kind of the growing range. It gets pretty hot here, and so above 90, apples start to show some stress, and so this clay is white, and so it changes the reflectivity of the leaf. So there's some evidence as well that lowers the temperature on the leaf surface, that maybe brings us into range of some more northern varieties that don't tolerate our heat as much. Anyway, so that's kind of what he does, and what does he take out? Michael really wants to remove the heavier chemical ingredients, insecticides, fungicides, antibiotics, herbicides, which a lot of agriculture is really heavy on. I know my friend John Allspaw had Parkinson's disease and died from Parkinson's. And there's a lot of correlation between fungicide and herbicides and the cause of Parkinson's. So as I kind of inherited his work, his methodology, I sprayed that stuff with him. As I now have kids, and I'm highly motivated to reduce those chemicals from my system and replace them with different systems, for my own health, my health of my kids, and my clients. All my clients have ponds on their farm, either directly below the orchard or not too far from their orchard. And they and their kids swim in these ponds. And so there's a lot of responsibility I have as far as what do I do for them in their land. I want their kids to be able to play in the orchard. I don't want to create a problem or a potential problem. So I'm not going to get into Michael's nth degree of his approach. There's a lot there. I didn't really have time to summarize it all, but these are two great books that I think need a lot more research. Michael tragically died 2 years ago. He had a heart attack in his orchard, and was really shocked that growers across the country and the world who have been enamored with Michael Phillips' approach and paradigm. And Michael started this website called the Holistic Orchard Network. And this is a group of folks across the country and the world who have read his books probably 10 times each, and they're all these citizen scientists who are trying to hone in spray systems, timing, cultural steps in the orchards to reduce pest load and disease load. And there's a lot of very cool stuff. And I see there's a huge need, and that what this network is trying to facilitate is sharing knowledge between these growers, testing new products, methods, and consulting. and sharing resources of disease identification, pest identification, and how to, if we're going to try to get new people into this industry, how do we create pathways for their involvement? So there's a lot here that I could see there's a huge need for research amongst folks like LU and other universities who want to help farmers and help landowners and help the farm workers all establish more and produce healthier methodologies. So there's a lot here that I would love to lean into. So in getting ready for this, Eleazar, with help of some AI, pulled together what is holistic orchard management, what is IPM, and I'm just going to talk about these, the first 5 and the second 5, and kind of give these methods a name. So cultural controls, so pruning, training, sanitization to prevent disease, to build up disease, pest and disease. So you saw in like those pictures, I use a trellis, and so that really helps get the spacing right. It keeps them up, good airflow around the tree, facilitates irrigation. That's drought stress is really, it's hard for a tree to be healthy if it's drought stress. But that pruning is key to help that airflow come through there. And so then sanitation would be like the drops that fall when you're thinning this time of year. Don't just drop them on the ground, but put them in a basket, because there's a bug in a lot of those. So you can thin out what fruit has been infested, get it out of there, feed it to your pigs or your chickens, get out of the orchard. So the biological controls, encouraging natural predators, parasites, beneficial. And this is kind of a topic that I'm really keenly interested in, something that the Center for Urban Agriculture has had a lot of success. I call it a forage chain for beneficial insects, from witch hazel, which blooms at degree day 1 of the season at a 50 degree base, to the end of the season. What are the flowers that are hoverflies, wasps, beetles, and other predator insects drink? And because a lot of these bugs, these hunters don't just eat bugs, they also forage for nectar. And so this is a key question I'm particularly interested in, is how do we make the nectar of these flowers not the limiting resource? And I would say in most farms, that forage chain of benefit of native plants, and buckwheat is not native, but it feeds a lot of insects. How do we make that an oversupply, so that the limiting resource of our predator insects is bugs for them to eat? That's the sweet spot we need to get to. And so we found that at our urban farm, the CCO's urban farm, next to the farmers market, and our one in college, which we've been there, this is our 14th, 15th season. We plant a lot of natives. We plant a lot, we do succession planting of buckwheat. We plant, let carrots go to seed, and specifically because they bring in hoverflies, and they bring nectar and they go hunt. And so there's a lot there that I'm really keenly interested in. And then knowing more, like what wasps love to eat San Jose scale. We need to encourage those wasps. What wasps love to eat can interface with codling moth or plum curculio, or these borers. We need to know more about who is on our side that are hunters out there in the orchard. Who are they that would eat the aphids, etc. And we know a little bit of that. We know ladybugs love to eat aphids. We need to know more of like who's working together and who's hunting who. That's some key knowledge we need to know. Physical controls, so traps, barriers, hand picking, and so the clay is kind of in that, it kind of could be in that realm. There are traps, there's netting. I think about birds would eat a lot of cherries. A lot of people ask about cicadas and netting trees. Yeah, I think that on a small scale it's practical. I've got thousands of trees I take care of, so it's just not practical on that scale. Our chemical control, so that's like our targeted, how do we, that's like the neem oils and whatever is in the spray tank, and like how do we put that out there? And that's, I think, what a lot of people want to know, like what is the chemical spray? Or what is the mix to spray and when? And I wish I knew the answer to that question. That is kind of the pursuit that I'm on, and that I know enough to know that I need to know a lot more to be able to hone it in. I often wonder, like, do I have really great fruit because I'm good or because I'm lucky? And it's hard to know the difference sometimes. So, so 5, monitoring forecasting. A lot of these pests do move on a biofix, like cowling moth is moving this week. So if we're tracking our degree day warming, we know when certain things hatch, and that's how we're more targeted with our sprays. So like I have a friend up Brant who's up in Mexico, Missouri. So he's really dialed that in so that he puts spinosad, which is an organic listed insecticide. It's very expensive. So you just can't just put it out there and hope you got it. You timed it right. You need to know, and you need to see, you need to be able to make sure it's done right. So our other half, resistant cultivars, yes. I mean, I have 140 varieties in my collection. I inherited 60 from John. I've more than doubled that. Really leaning more on the cider varieties, the proper ciders, and red flesh varieties. There was in those pictures you saw the purple leaves. Those will make purple fruit, and the flesh will be purple. It'll make a rosé cider. That's really desirable in the cider industry. And so this is the key question that I want to know, and why I'm doing variety trials now is I want to know what wants to grow here, what tastes good, what makes it desirable fruit, and is there ones that are both? You know, is it this fruit is really high quality, and the tree wants to be here, and then when is it ripe? And there's pros and cons to having all your apples come ready at the same time versus trying to run for a 5-month harvest window. And that with a variety trial, I have a 5-month harvest window right now. And people ask me what's my favorite variety. Well, depends on what month. Like I have a favorite in every window of harvest. And they all have their varying degrees of resistance to diseases. IPM, multiple approaches. How do we integrate all this? Yeah, that's a lot of monitoring. Soil health, yeah. We've got to make sure that we've do soil tests ahead of time. I'll talk about kind of one of my approaches is site prep. I don't think you can get healthy soil in a fescue dominated ground cover. Fescue is antimycorrhizal, and a big chunk of apple trees and most fruit trees root system is mycorrhizally tied, so they don't go together. Cover cropping, you saw the picture where I was kind of running that tiller just adjacent to the rows to get that fescue back, and buckwheat in there. Buckwheat is very generous to the soil. A lot of its energy is fed as liquid carbon through sugars into the soil. That feeds the soil, feeds the apple trees. Our biodiversity, I've already talked about that, kind of in the biological controls, and then learning. I mean, yeah. So this is what AI came up with. I think it's a pretty good list. And so I'll jump ahead to my top 7, and I'll go through my season. So my top 7 that I came up with and getting ready for this is investing in site prep, fescue. Again, I can't oversell how important it is to get rid of fescue. Cover cropping in that ground. I like to do a year of site prep on my orchards, and so that's either spraying out the fescue with Roundup and or tilling a year of cover crop or 2, adding compost, adding other amendments to balance the soil. Apples love calcium, so gypsum is always helpful, especially our clay soils, help loosen that up. You can't overdo site prep. Putting a tree like into a fescue field right away is not a recipe for success. You need to do something to improve the soil, get that fescue back. The trellising, yeah, having a good trellis, even on larger size trees, is I would say is desirable. If anything, it just gets your drip tape up off the ground. And so I use these orchard rubber bands to attach my drip tape to that wire. So you can see it where you have leaks. If your tape is in your ground cover, you're gonna mow it, it's gonna get chewed on by mice. I do a lot of scything, which is actually actually more efficient in a lot of ways than mowing and way safer for the trees. And I never run a weed whacker in the tree. It's the fastest way to kill a tree is to get a weed whacker. But that trellis system supports all of that. If you're running dwarf trees on a shorter rootstock, you've got to have trellis. Without that, trees will fall over. Because the dwarf trees are precocious. They want to produce fruit, and you'll get a tree that's year 5 or 6, 7, and there's maybe 10 pounds of wood, and it'll try to grow 30 pounds of fruit. And without a trellis, that tree is going to runt out and it will never recover. But up on a trellis, now you can kind of keep the form, keep the buds pointing up. Trellis is really important. Having number 3, a smart layout. So making sure we get our rows organized for mowing or spraying and then harvesting. In my variety trials, there's a lot going on. And so how do we get like varieties next to each other, and how do we plant in ripening order so that we're out there in July, all the July bearing apples are next to each other. There's not 2 here and 3 here and 1 here. There's no efficiency in that. So you gotta pull together. And that's really, I think, what I pulled from John Allspa's work. When I lay out my variety trials, I can put ripening order together. And so that's gonna save me lots of steps. Literally walking around. For deer fencing, I think deer are maybe one of the hardest parts about growing fruit trees here. I use the moron method, and so I just do a lot of fencing, and so tall, deep, electric. And I found we got a full moon coming up, the full moons in May. I've been burnt in the past because the young deer are getting out. The full moon, they can see really well all night long, and they want to go explore. And so we have to kind of think like a deer, and check regularly, so they can do a lot. Sometimes they come in, you'll see a little bit of browse, and that was a scout. And then they talk to each other. They're friends, so they talk to, hey, there's an orchard over there full of fruit. Let's all go next Thursday. And so they can really do a lot of damage. And that kind of relates to the question I get, well, how long until these fruit trees produce crops? Well, every time you get browsed on deer in a heavy way, you can add a year to that timeline, in my assessment. So if you get browsed every year, you'll never get a crop because you're always pushing back that 5-year out. You need 5 years without deer to get any fruit. So if you have a taller rootstock, you can outgrow deer and be above the browse height. But you have to, again, at least 5 years to get past the browse height. Those establishment years are so critical. And so this is a smart layout. When I'm laying out an orchard, I never plant the whole acre on the first year. I plant it over the course of a few years, knowing that we've not disrupted the deer's habit, and they're going to eat they're going to browse on all the trees in the first year or 2. So let's only have 20% of the area planted, so that we can figure out where they're getting in. The way to control risk. We're going to take a little bit of patience on establishment and save some money. 5, this own topic: keep vestigia from trees, tillage, hoeing, mowing, herbicide. And there's a sweet spot. There's this unicorn ground cover mix that I would love to experiment with this. Underneath the trees, is there a low growing, flowering mix that we can mow once a year in the summer and once a year in the winter, and it doesn't grow up into the canopy of the tree? I think it's out there. It's going to take some research to figure out what is that mix, and if we come in and side under it in June, how does that change the succession dynamics of that ground cover versus coming into July, and knowing what are we letting seed and what are we not. And it's a precision there. I don't know the answer to that question, but there's something there. I think if it's all native cover, I think conservation would have a lot of interest in that particular question. We're talking about the forage chain, number 6. We need nectar and habitat. It's not the limiting resource, but the bug population. That's the sweet spot that I think is the biggest part, I think, of holistic management. That part. It's not just the trees, it's the broader neighborhood around it. So that could be adjacent. You saw in one of those pictures, I was tilling a big field next to the orchard. That's in buckwheat right now. So that is getting foraged on by insects. So having adjacent plots, not just under the tree, but adjacent plots that have diversity in it. And then finally, right scaling. Apples have a lot of economy of scale versus like one apple in your backyard or five. Like the time it takes you to get your backpack set up and figure out what you're going to spray, you take 15 seconds per tree to take care of it. And so there's all this setup costs for small orchards that those super small orchards, they're just not sprayed in fact for most practical purposes, which is fine. But as you get some scale, it becomes feasible to do a more aggressive interventions and to kind of have enough fruit that's worth selling to markets, to hire teams of people to do the work sold on it. And I think that's where we need to go. I'll jump back to the kind of seasons. Well, this is simplified. I should have put simplified in bold because I'm missing a lot of things in here. But just starting with our dormant season, pruning, try and get that done as early as possible in the new year. Dormant oil and copper. That's copper especially is like that's like the hammer of it knocks back a lot of bacteria and fungus on the system. Dormant oil is key for smothering a lot of overwintering pests. Single-phase scale being one of the most important ones to control. I do tree planting during dormant season, so nursery work. I try to plant as early as possible so that I'm not trying to plant during the bloom, which is just from my logistics, it's just not ideal. But getting them as early as possible so they can wake up on the season and not wake up after they've been in a cooler and then set out there. And so a lot of people plant in the fall for that reason, but I've had the most success planting it early in March, late February, March, early April. To get to the bloom sequence, we change into our first holistic mix. So there's foliar fertilizers, so it's like plant available fish fertilizers, our probiotic blends that are in there. So that's just overwhelming the system with diversity. Like EM1 is it's like it smells like soy sauce. It's like this cultivated brew that has a broad spectrum of bacteria and yeasts and fungi. And I both mix that in that big green tank you saw, and I also make smaller batches, feed it with molasses and fish oils, blow up that population, and then spray that on. And so how much of that bacteria survives and like lives on the tree and gets into the tree, it's hard to know. Most of it's going to die in the sun and the wind. And so as those little bacteria die, are their parts, can they be plant available and be picked up by the plant? Or are they food for the next generation of the microbiome living on the tissue? Or when they die, are there exudates that are antifungal, antimicrobial? I have more questions in that realm. But it's tiny stuff that I can't see.
Science should be.
Yeah, we know more. So bloom is when we get our irrigation rolling. So we get into bloom. That's when we really ramp up or post bloom. You know, as soon as petal fall, that's like the key time that our flowers have been pollinated. That fruit is sizing up fast. That fruit is very small and tender, and that's when a lot of the bugs and disease get a foothold into the fruit. And so we ramp up our clay content, calcium and silica that's plant available can get into the plant, really give the apples what it needs. Our probiotic, our neem oils. This is where our insecticides, or whether they're like BT or spinosad or mixing in other like non-organic pesticides. This is where they get the most bang for your buck. Right after bloom, get a lot of fruit out there. 7 is often used as a thinning agent. It's good. It protects the it's not organic, but it protects the fruit, thins the fruit. Also in that post bloom, that's where we do some tillage and cover crop around the tree, thinning fruit, etc. You can find those clusters, pick the ugliest fruit out, leave the best. We get into summer, now we're still in that second, we're kind of in that holistic mix, heavier on the clay, that is a sunscreen and a pest repellent. Tip pruning on over vigorous trees, there's a real art to summer pruning. A lot of producers will run a sickle bar mower at an angle and hedge back their trees. And that they'll tip this really aggressive shoot, and then it triggers back into the system to really encourage spur bearing, keep that center of gravity tight on the trellis. We get to the harvest season, I pull back on my sprays at that point. We pick up drops, don't let that's a sanitation problem. And then enjoy the fruit. I mean, that's why we do it, and I think sometimes I'm crazy. Like, what have I gotten myself into? And then I eat that first apple. Oh yeah, this is delicious. I get it. And then we get into post harvest, our third mixed category. That's really got, again, up the fish oils to try to get the leaf break down faster. We chop the leaves, we mow, and we winterize irrigation. A lot of disease cycles are on the leaf. They'll overwinter and apple leaves are a lot like oak leaves. They have a lot of tannins in them, so they're quite sturdy. It takes them a year to break down or more. Whereas like maple leaves and catalpa leaves, they'll almost disintegrate as soon as they hit the ground and get frosted on. Where these leaves are really hardy. And seeding natives, like that's best in the wintertime. Get some bare dirt, get the seed in there. Yeah.
Going back to that, it's like, have you ever tried the silvopasture system to go with the orchard?
Yeah, so pasture in the orchard. One of my clients raises pigs under her trees, and then has gotten rid of all the fescue. And kind of hard to be in there. And she pulls them out when they get into harvest season. So it's definitely not. There's pros and cons to that. And I've seen people online who raise sheep who they stay much lower, less likely to browse on the tree. I think it'd be really interesting. And I think having preliminary conversation with the landowner who's got big acreage. He's interested in planting honey locust and oaks on a real wide spacing. And I'm keen to think like, versus just putting a tree in a fescue patch, how do we cultivate like a 10 by 10 box and then put a couple apples in there, put a couple honey locusts, put a burrow, flood it with 100 different native wildflowers, and then let it come up, and they'll train each other up. And it's very opposite of just a tree in a fescue patch, but really cultivate and then to make these patches and then graze underneath that, and having pigs do most of the harvesting as the trees drop. You know, if we can fatten up livestock on the land with tree crops, that is like kind of one of the dreams of it. And again, if we were going to rotate pigs, we can graft certain areas in the setting. We know we have all these July, the pigs are here because the apples are here in July, and so we can rotate the pigs kind of with that forage exchange for them to eat.
So whether chicken maybe maybe good option too, because they don't damage the plant that they
Yeah, that's what one of my other clients have encouraged. Like we could to try to graze that, to knock the fescue back and really cycle nutrients, the pests that emerge out of the soil. I think the chickens and turkeys on a pasture system is very promising as well. So yeah, I guess we're getting close to the top of the hour. So what's next? I think for me and for this industry, refining and testing these mixes, the timing of all these, understanding these biofix states when we know things are emerging and flying, so that we can really optimize with our sprays. Mating disruption pheromones, I really think that there's a lot of new products coming onto the market. For example, next year, supposedly a San Jose scale pheromone disruptor will be on the market. And so basically it smells like female bug, like pheromones for their sex. And so the males can't find the females, their mating success goes way down. And then that's another way to control scale. Dormant oil is the primary recommendation. There is a pesticide that people spray on it, but it's very heavy pesticide. It's not on the far end of the spectrum of heavy pesticides. I don't think it's the right solution to that problem. other like species list I mentioned earlier, what is that species list of flowers through the entire season? Like I would love to see that on a time scale within the year. To make sure that we always have something for those bugs to eat and that kind of ramp up that population, that biodiversity over time. More variety trials. I've more than doubled my collection. I have about 24 new varieties I've never tasted before that are coming into bearing this year. So there's some promising leads there. I like what I'm seeing on some of them, on their willingness to vigor to grow. Is that fruit palatable? How does it fit in a fresh eating like a farmer's market stand output, or is it better for cider baking? It'll take a few years of tasting because as she gets some more data on that. People, meeting more people, both landowners who are wanting to establish these smaller estate orchards or homestead orchards on scale, and the people who want to work in that setting and to learn orchards. And so, one of the challenging things of all this is that like the hatch of cowling moth only happens once a year, so you have 12 months to forget what you're supposed to do before it happens again. So that's one of the challenging things, is this unfolds so slowly that it's easy to miss things. And then if you make a mistake, you have a long time to think about it or get ready. And so you, at its best, you are exponentially better every year. But in reality, we're all human, trying to do our best we can. So we learn slowly because of that. So how do we work with our institutions, like our extension and our folks like John Allspot, who like did decades of work to how to build on that. That's a harder question. So yeah, we're gonna put up the hour open to questions.
I saw you have buying this. How do you ever do you market there? Can I buy someone, or how people can connect with you to start?
To buy some trees. Yeah, I do sell kind of some small runs. I prefer to do large orders, and just because the cost of transaction is so high for me. I like to keep the eye on the tree and ensure success. I've seen the quality under my care. The trees grow really well. Whereas I've sold some trees to people and they get browse budgie every year, and it's like kind of hard to see that. So
Was considered for you like heirloom varieties in this case, because your mentor was starting developing those varieties, right? And then you continue with his legacy to create those varieties. How many years are you talking about for developing this?
Yeah. So the question I have one line in here. So other heirloom varieties, he primarily he did not do crosses, so he didn't really do any seedling varieties, so he wasn't establishing new varieties, but mainly getting, you hear like what's on his wish list. He wants Baldwin or Winesap, and there's like there's sports, like 1 in 1,000 grafted apples will mutate a single gene. And sometimes that is a bigger apple, it's a more red apple, it moves the harvest window up or down a week. And so there's sports of these, so like there's Gala and there's Royal Gala. So it's a little bit larger, a little bit less green and more on the yellow, rosy color. And so he was collecting those. And so some of those are really old varieties that are Thomas Jefferson had on his farm 300 years ago. And some are newer newer releases that are 30, 40 years old. Nothing super new, all that stuff under patent. So I don't mess with anything that's super new. I don't want to go there.
That is a very good way to connect with established varieties that don't come from hybrids, genetics, come from heritage.
Yeah, and it's America had a unique kind of genetic bottleneck of apples during Prohibition, because at the time that was most alcohol was from cider. It was just so much easier to raise apples than it was to raise grain, and so the folks who were pushing against Prohibition, they cut out a lot of cider orchards and they just burnt them, and so we lost untold number of varieties that were adapted here. And so there's a movement now of orcharders and nursery people around the country. Like Harrison is a variety that they thought was extinct, but they found like one Harrison apple in New Jersey or somewhere. And they said, they looked in the record, like, this is Harrison, and it's super branchy, really vigorous, yellow. And this is a description from 200 years ago, and so now it's become very popular, it's a great cider variety. So yeah, that's come along. I have done a little bit of seedling work, so like Gold Rush is a really great apple. Been one of the tastiest, the late season, right, flesh is so good. Like getting punched in the face, it's got this great flavor, but it gets cedar apple rust really bad. And so I will save those seeds and germinate them, and when they come up, half of those seedlings have orange dots on the leaves, and I rip those out, because that's cedar apple rust. But the half that don't show any cedar apple rust, it lost that trait. And hopefully it kept the traits of quality fruit. And so I'll know in 50 years if that's true, but that's the long game pursuit, hopefully less than 50 years, hopefully less.
But do you think that's to produce a new variety, you have to have process, or just give it by chance? But breeders, vegetables and fruit trees, they cross male and female and they select the characters and see their ability for disease, or they have disease resistant, there's like the rootstocks we talked about, AM1 or AM9 or 27.
Yeah.
They did it for purpose.
Yeah, and we need more of that. And I
Yes.
think like, how do we, disease resistance is I think the chief thing. Because how do because we have cedars really hard, heavy here. And I have friends who bought trees from nurseries around the country. They're like, oh yeah, buy Gold Rush, it's disease resistant. Well, to apple scab, but I don't think people in New York realize that there's thousands of cedar trees in every square mile here. And so it's hard to recommend to plant that here.
And some of
You do, like, you can put on a bigger rootstock because the cedar apple rust will rob vigor. And so I don't plant, I do grab Gold Rush, but never on dwarf. I size it up, a rootstock, a more vigorous rootstock to try to give it a fighting chance.
some of them, they are not even disease problems, some of them they are physiological problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a big difference between disease and physiological problems.
That's right. Yeah, there's some varieties in my collection that every year they apples crack. That's a horrible trait,
Yes.
because you'll never get a crop off of it. You're just harboring disease in the whole place. So and so John I really challenged. He was ruthless. If he didn't like a variety, rip it out. If it's too biennial, like Melrose is a great variety, very biennial. I like it because it'll hang on the tree. You could pick that for 5 weeks and it tastes great for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
No, I can't think of any other variety that has that long of a picking window. So that, to me, that's really desirable. I like that long window.
But don't you think you can solve this problem a little bit by just thinning the fruits?
Yeah,
It will, because we have this character for olive, and palm dates. This year have a crop, next year no crop,
Yeah.
because he has heavy crop this year, so no buds formation for next year, and that's good work for apples.
yeah, and that's true. And that's the only way to kind of balance it out. But if you get a frost,
Yeah,
you know you're gonna have a heavy crop the next year, and so it's expensive to thin fruit. And so that's the trade-offs on this are
Yes.
constant, so.
Just marketing that. So do you do some kind of agro tourism thing like pick yourself that or?
Yeah, so question, folks online, the U-Pick, yes, so on one of those orchards that's on Smith Hatchery Road, I showed some pictures of. We last year piloted like a guided U-Pick, and we're gonna do more of that this year. And so anytime between like the last week of June and November, we'll have like a ticketed event to come out there, and I'll walk people through, pick the fruit, I'll pick it, give everybody a bite, and we'll taste 3 to 15 varieties. And so we will add like some crackers and salami and cheese to kind of, because it cleanses your palate. there's certain varieties like Florina is so aromatic that it tastes like rose, like flowers. It's delicious, but that flavor is so strong, you'll have it in your mouth all day long, which is desirable. I think. I don't think it's off-putting, but if you have that first, every apple has it. So you need this palate, and there's some cider varieties that are so tannic that like it's the stringentness of your mouth is just too intense. So yeah, I think that's fun. It's very kid friendly. I did like a 15 elementary school kids out there, and they ate a dozen varieties of apple, and they hung with me the whole time. They had a great time.
But usually for, for testing, for, that grading or something, right? Usually suppose the kids who, or the person who do testing, is supposed not to swallow, because if he swallow, and at the beginning he is hungry, but he will not feed the adults,
He's eating a dozen varieties of apple at the end. They're kind of like, ah.
Yeah.
But mainly the recipe or the education is like, we're tasting for ripeness.
Yeah.
The Gala is, I think it's one of my favorites. It's, when you take a bite and you're like, you want to keep eating more and more and more. But if you eat a Gala 2 weeks early, you're like, this is the worst apple I've ever had. It doesn't taste good until it's amazing. And then it's really good. And Gala don't fall off the tree, they hang. And an overripe Gala, it loses texture, but the flavor gets so intense, like a cherry Coca-Cola. It's like effervescent, it's super sweet. The texture is not that good, but it's a lot of times where you're picking, when apples start falling, it's time to pick. But that's not true in all apples, So
But do you guys experience with different fruits other than apples, like peaches?
I have like 30 varieties of pear as well. So I have less experience. They're all pretty new to me.
Yeah, what is the best variety for Central Missouri apple?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I wish I had a good answer for you. It's disease resistance is kind of the most important thing. It depends on, like, Pristine is a really good early variety. Gala does really well. I have to get my list. I'm gonna name all of them. It's hard to pick your favorite, right? Liberty does a good job. Liberty, like dry farmed, it's like tastes like a Concord grape. It has a really strong flavor of grape. Cameo is a good variety, good producer.
Like commercially, where we can find local apples here in
The farmer's market, I think, is really, and if you go a little bit further west to like Waverly, Lexington, there's some really big apple orchards there. And they sell into the grocery store supply, but they also have roadside stands. So they have a smaller variety selection because they're growing for the packers in the area. But I think they have some smaller runs. Like they have Lodi, which is like the first variety. It's a good sauce apple. That was what William was holding in that first picture. It was a Lodi apple.
I think that is part of my talking next time about the market, about the Africa.
Yeah, I think one of my goals is in marketing is that there's some really good summer apples. Like the conventional wisdom, it's like, oh, it's late September, I want to go find apples. Well, people have already missed like 2.5, 3 months of arguably some of the best varieties have already come and gone by late September.